providing many of you the opportunity to learn a little bit about what is the OCRF, what do we cover, where are some of our information on our website. And once again, I'm going to just open that up at the end to open Q&A. So the first thing that I'm going to do is hopefully share my screen. 1 second, I'll let someone in from the. Right, excellent. So at this time, I'm hoping that you are seeing my screen. And I'm going to ask Laura Tesler, are you able to see my screen? All right, looks like Laura is having some microphone issues. Yep, okay, thank you guys. So first thing we're going to do is basically just cover where you're able to get most of the information about the OCRF. And for some of you that are potentially new to what the OCRF is, give you a really brief background on what we are and what the purpose of this fund is. So the Oregon Conservation and Recreation Fund really kind of hit the ground running in early 2020. And the purpose of this fund is for a new way for all Oregonians to really help fund conservation and recreation throughout the state of Oregon. So the OCRF really is meant as a granting body, and its purpose is really to fund projects that are at that intersection of conservation and recreation. So we fund a whole range of different projects from pollinator habitats to rebuilding infrastructure on trails, so trailheads, bridges, gazebos. We also fund many access such as hunting and fishing, accessibility, new gear, but really throughout the purpose of what is the OCRF, it really is to encourage Oregonians to get out into nature and encourage Oregonians to really think about how are they part of nature and how is nature part of what they do through this double edge of conservation and recreation. So this is our main website, and you can see at the top are how you get to us. So you can Google just OCRF, ODFW, and it will send you right to the main page. On the main page, click on our granting button. You'll come right to this section. So a couple things that I do want to draw your attention to on this website, and these are similar but slightly modified from previous rounds of the OCRF. So the OCRF since 2020, when we first began, this is our 4th granting cycle. And the goal for this granting cycle is we'll be providing roughly 20 projects will be funded at a maximum funding level of about $50,000 each. It is important for us just to kind of make sure that it's clear that public and private not-for-profits are our intended audience. And in order to apply, you will need to have your organization have a 501c3 status. And there is information on exactly what that is within our expenditure framework that I'll pop up next. So unfortunately, private individuals are not able to apply, and also 501c4s cannot also apply. And if you need information about exactly what the difference between those different classifications are, I can provide that to you later on, and it is also found within our expenditure framework. So the first thing I do want to show is that our timeline for when our funding is going to be available. So our applications opened August 12th. Our deadline is going to be October 7th. So they'll be open for roughly about 6 weeks or so. And we are in this current funding round hoping to kind of condense our review process, but also make sure that we are as deliberate as possible through this review process. So reviews are going to have a 2-leveled approach, where first we're going to have internal ODFW reviews between October to November. Then our OCRF advisory committee is going to review projects in December with applications having their final approval from our ODFW commission in December 16th of 2022, and funds will not be available until March 1st. And that's really important for individuals on this call to think about, is because as you put in your project applications and your project timelines, I do want to make sure that you are aware that if awarded, you would not receive funds until March 1st. So whatever project design and timeline that you put forward needs to be from March 1st onward. So funds for this current round are primarily going to be provided by state funding sources. So the OCRF in their last legislative cycle received roughly $4 million in drought relief package funding, in addition to another $1 million in general OCRF operation funds. I do want to make sure that individuals are aware that although we encourage projects to have a drought or aquatic lens, by your project not having one, by no means does that affect your score, and it does not affect your ability to get funding. But you will see when we walk through the application, if you do have a drought, aquatic resilience, or just a general climate lens to your project, there is a question that kind of helps us designate that. But once again, it's not required and you are not going to be scored against that. So next thing I do want to draw your attention to is our expenditure framework. And this document you will actually find, I'm going to click right back so that you can see, at the bottom of our main granting page, you will see that right here in our link. And we highly encourage all of our applicants to review this document in detail. And the reason for that is that it clearly explains who can apply, what our OCRF priorities are, basically that lens of conservation and recreation, and also really helps provide some of our different guidelines of what we really are looking for within a project. So please feel free to look through this. We highly encourage it. And if you have any questions, you're at all times, you're welcome to reach back out to me. I also want to draw your attention to our scoring criteria. So this is a new document from the last time that you may or may not have applied to the OCRF. And this is really what our OCRF Advisory Committee will be using to review your applications. So once again, as I described earlier, OCRF applications have a two-tier approach. First, they are kind of technically reviewed by the ODFW technical staff, and that's really just for understanding of the methods. Are there any concerns of what this project's doing? Are there any questions? The OCRF technical staff do not have a formal scoring rubric, and they do not actually formally score your project. They just put forward questions for the main OCRF committee to consider. And our OCRF committee, you'll see on our website, is made up of individuals who volunteer their time to sit on our board. And they really are experts in a wide range of things. Our board has backgrounds in science and research, education and outreach, communications, and they're the ones really using this scoring sheet. This scoring sheet is numerically scored, so you'll see that each of these different categories are out of 6 points. You'll have at least 2 OCRF advisory members score your project. And then what we will do is we'll change these raw scores, numeric scores, into rankings based on how your projects kind of came out through a specific score. And this is really kind of, it sounds complicated, but it's a way for us to adjust scores, since you'll have 2 of the 9 advisory members reading and scoring your project. It kind of helps us adjust for if there is an advisory member that scores a little harsher than others. It helps kind of nullify whatever that might or might not be. So in this scoring criteria, I'm going to go real briefly through it. Obviously, there is the main buckets, which is the criteria. So on this page, you'll see clarity of the proposal, cost efficiency, timelines. And then you'll see off to the considerations, basically what is being considered to get those full 6 points for each of these different categories. So I'm going to keep going through. These are pretty self-explanatory, but I do want to specifically draw your attention to the outdoor equity piece. And this is something that regardless of if your project really falls on a conservation or a recreation side, you are highly encouraged and obviously graded against. Does your project look at outdoor equity? How do we bring people back to that concept of how is nature part of Oregonians' lives and how are Oregonians part of nature? And this really comes back to breaking down boundaries and breaking down barriers for people who may or may not normally see themselves in these positions or have access to these positions. And you can see some of these scoring criteria here. You do not need to necessarily kind of check each of these different line items under this criteria to get full points, but you really need to be very deliberate about what you're doing. The OCRF is extremely dedicated to diversity, equity, and inclusion, and we incorporate this throughout all of the scoring criteria, but also specifically through this outdoor equity aspect. There are many, many things that can really help check the box here and really kind of embed outdoor equity into your project. And I would stress that we are looking for projects that embed this and don't have this as an afterthought. So when you think about how are you going to, as the first line item says, have projects engage Oregonians in solutions, we want you to identify which communities, which areas, which organizations you're going to reach out to work on your project with, and list those as your project partners. We don't want to see, I will engage elementary schools. We want you to be specific so that it shows deliberate thoughtfulness without this. So once again, kind of folding in the next things I do want to highlight on this scoring criteria is really appropriate demonstration of project involvement, project partner involvement. Project partners are really key to a successful OCRF grant. We highly encourage our applicants to think very thoughtfully about who they want to bring into their projects and how they want to incorporate them. So project partners are more than just someone who benefits from the project. It's someone who is part of the project and is involved within the project. And this involvement can be in multiple forms. It can be from those helping to provide project match. We'll cover that a little bit later. It could be individuals helping to provide the work, volunteering their time, providing their expertise, but something that's really integral to the project. And a project partner needs to be shown as someone that really needs to be at the table and is actively at the table in order for the project to kind of move forward. Measurability is also a really important one I do want to highlight, and we'll talk about this when we go through the project proposal itself. We really want to make sure that you think about how is your project going to be considered successful? What makes a successful project, and what are the ways you are going to be able to measure this? So measuring doesn't need to be numeric, although numeric is nice depending on what you're doing. It can be quantitative, it could be qualitative. So once again, quantitative numbers, qualitative, really stories, opinions, interviews, things like that you can do if your project's very people oriented. But we want you to be very thoughtful about what you're going to build into your project to do this, because all projects are required, if funded, to provide a written project report at the end. We will be asking you to report back on what you originally put in your project proposal. So the last thing that I really want to cover here is just the alignment with the OCRF program priorities. And this is the major bucket that your project is going to be graded upon. And this is where you're going to lean very heavily on your expenditure framework and what your project is trying to promote. So you can see these are just considerations. You don't have to do every single one of these little bullets here in order to get full points, but we want you to be very thoughtful on what you're doing. So as we started, this is the OCRF, the Conservation and the Recreation Fund. And we really fund projects that are mainly recreation with a conservation lens, mainly conservation with a recreation lens, but we really want to try to get everyone the best that they can towards that equal kind of, this is conservation and recreation. So when we think about this through the OCRF alignment, really be very deliberate when you think about what is being addressed through the conservation aspects of my project, and really look at the Oregon Conservation Strategy. You can see that here, and you'll see a link to that on our website as well. And the Oregon Conservation Strategy really is the state's blueprint and what we're looking to fill gaps in. So you'll see that there's different key habitats, there's different key species, there's different key regions. And we want you to think about, how does your project address those things? In the same lens, as you kind of think about how does your project increase recreation, there's also resources listed on our website of different key aspects of recreation that the state really wants us to think about. And that has to do with access to recreation, who can recreate, how can they recreate, and you can see things here. Some examples of projects that have been at the kind of the crosshairs of this really well is we've had projects that are surveying for freshwater mussels, but bring in local kayakers to kind of help with that and teach people how to kayak. We have had projects that increase trail access, really that recreation concept, but as they're increasing trail access, they are surveying for invasive species and really thinking about how do they improve the habitat around their trail so that it is lower in invasive species, higher in native species, and as they replant and put ground cover down, what are they going to do to really be conservation minded for the habitats that they're in? So with that, I am going to stop sharing my screen for just a second, and I'm going to pause if there's any questions before we move on to our review of the application. So question, I'm going to read this aloud. The Oregon Conservation Strategy does not identify beavers as a strategy species. How will this grant cycle weigh projects that are focused strongly around the species? So that is a great question. So yes, beavers specifically are not within the Oregon Conservation Strategy. However, a lot of the habitats in which beavers are listed in the conservation strategy. In addition, beavers do serve a lot of ecosystem purposes and really help promote healthy conservation within the regions that they often are, through dam building and through really water retention on the landscape. So to your point, beavers specifically aren't listed as a strategy species, but the habitats they often are found in are. So that would still very much count as addressing the Oregon Conservation Strategy. So I might pause and see if there's any other questions. And okay, looks like I did answer that question. Are there any other questions before we move on to the application? All right, hearing none, let me share my screen again. And I am going to go through our application. Okay, so hopefully all of you have had the ability to kind of flip through our application before, but I'm just going to give you a really high level kind of pointers on what is our application, what are we looking for. And I want to kind of draw your attention to that the scoring sheet that I just walked us through does not clearly align, how do I phrase this? It's not one for one on our application. So when you kind of look through our application, many of those different buckets that we score on is woven throughout our application. So we want to make sure that you kind of think about, how do you incorporate outdoor equity throughout different questions here on the application? How do you really think about specifically the OCRF goals, programmatic goals, and how can you weave that throughout your application? And if you have any questions on that, I'm happy to kind of go through. So you will notice that for better or for worse, our OCRF applications are on Google Forms. We acknowledge this is extremely cumbersome, depending on your ability to navigate Google Forms. Our recommendation is that you take a look at the application. You can actually do a print screen of the whole application and work on the application offline in a Word document or however you normally prefer to do your word processing. So therefore, you always have a copy of your text to then work in your application. Going in and out of your application, although you can do it, it's set up to allow you to, has caused issues in the past. So I would highly recommend print it off physically or do a screen grabs, however you choose to work in a normal word processing function, save all of your answers in that to then copy and paste in here. You will notice that none of my boxes in the questions have firm word counts. We do want you to be respectful if I say roughly 2,000 words. I am not going to sit there and count your spaces, or did Google Forms decide to count this as 1 word or 2 words with your hyphen? That's too cumbersome for everyone. These word counts are really suggestions, just so that you have a sense of roughly what we think about is going to be needed to answer the question. By no means you have to go up to all of your word counts, but we really don't want you to go past them very far. But if you have a sentence or two you need to get in there and you're over by a few words, that is not a problem. All right, I do see a question in here, and I will address this, Tim, just in a few minutes when we go through our next ones. So I'm going to go through these sections. I'm going to go through them pretty briefly, but I do want to highlight some new questions that we have. If you've gone through this application in the past, you'll notice that this current proposal is longer than normal. So just to be clear, so our first kind of section is primary contact and lead organization. I do want to be clear that we do need a point of contact that's a physical person. It could be anyone at your lead organization, but we also need the lead organization information. So, and it's also actually beneficial for us to get the primary contact's email in addition to the lead organization's email. And that really is purposeful, not meant for you just to give the same email. If you have to, that's totally fine. If you're the executive director and that is your email, not a problem, put it twice. But if you have your own executive director email and a generic info email, I would ask to give both. That way it gives me a couple points of contact for me to reach you at. So this is basically just basic info. Should be pretty standard for most applications. Next thing is really project logistics. Remember, this is where I want you to make sure that you're clear. No project can start prior to March 1st, 2023. And we ask that no projects extend past January 1st to 2025. That said, you do not need to have a 2-year project. We just ask that you don't extend past that. If there is a really good reason your project must extend past that, please contact myself as the program coordinator and we can discuss that. Some projects do really need that additional field season in the early spring, and that could be accommodated for, but we do need to know that prior to your application being put in. In project location, this is basically the nearest city. We acknowledge that some of these projects are being done very rural and not near things, but we do want some sort of landmarks provided to the best of your ability. So once again, just kind of project overview, project title. Please have your project title be descriptive of what you're doing. I've had applicants actually use their name as their project title, and that has gotten very confusing. So as an example, if your project is beaver restoration in the Willamette Valley, that's a project title. Try to give enough information that we can easily see this. Project abstract, very straightforward, but I do want to make sure this is kind of more of a traditional abstract sense, where in your abstract, we really need to know a condensed version of your whole application, basically. Who's doing the work, why you're doing the work, how you're doing the work, and what the outcome will be. And roughly, once again, 450 words or less. If you're at 500, not a problem. Just keep it roughly at that. So here's one thing I do want to stress for the group is project objectives. And this is where it's a little bit different. And so is project measures of success. Some of the projects and most of our projects actually are very large. So there are parts of the project that will be funded by OCRF, and there's parts of the project that are funded by other funders. When you provide your project objectives, it's perfectly fine for you to do your whole project. So kind of the start, the middle, the end. But one thing I do want to be clear is that if OCRF is really only funding the start place, we want you to be very specific about what objectives are being funded by OCRF and what objectives are being funded by other organizations. So as an example here, if you are clearing brush, then you are going to build trailhead, and then you are going to build a bridge, and then you are going to hold a workshop for people to learn how to hike. So that's 4 different objectives. If OCRF is only going to be able to fund the first 2, so clearing the brush and building kind of the trailhead and the trail, write those 2 objectives and denote them either with a hyphen or brackets, however makes sense in your brain, that OCRF funded. You then can type your other 2 objectives and say funded by other sources. That really just helps us know what exactly our funding is going towards. Same as project measures of success. So if you have 4 objectives listed, you really should have 4 different ways of measuring success for each of those objectives. And once again, be very clear about kind of which measure of success is going to be used for which of the objectives. Sometimes you can share measures of success. So in my example that I just gave, you can say, hypothetically, clearing brush, building your trailhead, and building your infrastructure. And as a result, of those 3 objectives, a measure of success is the public has access to my area. Or 100 members of the public now has access to my area. These are examples, but that measure of success could cover more than one objective. Always reach out if this isn't making any kind of sense, but we're just trying to streamline this process and have it make a little bit more clarity for the reviewers. And once again, project timeline, this can be kind of a real brief, kind of, this is when I'm trying to do this, like rough months, March to April, April to May, May until September. What are you trying to do in each of these sections? So let's go to the next one. So this is kind of the next section that's a little bit different. So I'm going to spend a little bit of time. This is your project narrative, or really the bulk of what your project is. Okay, I see a couple of specific questions. So thank you guys. As you are adding questions, I will address specific questions in the chat at the end, but if you have a question about exactly what I'm talking about on the screen itself, feel free to unmute or raise your hand just so that we don't lose some of the content specific for what's up versus some of your more specific questions. But moving on to this project narrative, this is a little bit different from what we've done in the past, but it's all the same information. Really, we want to know, what is your project background? What are you trying to address? Why does it matter? Once again, this really goes to your OCRF programmatic priorities, and this is where we're going to get a lot of the information. Also, project implementation. What are you doing? How are you going to do it? What tools are you going to need? Project partners, we've kind of talked about this a little bit already. This is really important for us to know who is already committed to the project and what are they going to do. So this is also kind of very specific measures of outdoor equity. Let us know which of these you are doing. Once again, you do not need to do all of them, but we do want to make sure that you are doing at least one of these throughout your project. This very clearly helps your score. And then your project justification. Why does this matter? How are you moving the needle in making a difference? And this is where we want you to be more specific about outdoor equity. Explain which of those things you're doing and how. Once again, approximate word counts. We don't want you to write volumes, but we don't want you to sit there and spend your time counting words. If you're a little over 3,000, that's fine. If you're at 1,000 and you are giving the information that you want, that's perfect. You are not graded or scored against reaching our maximum limit. That's just what we think is appropriate to answer the question. So moving on to the next one, this is really project alignment. This is where we just get into more of the clicking of the buttons. There really isn't a lot of text in this section or other subsequent sections. Ecoregions, it is important for us to know where in Oregon your work is done. If you actually are doing work in multiple ecoregions, and if you need to understand where the ecoregion is, you can click on the button right here and it'll take you to a map. So click wherever and however it applies. Once again, are you conservation, recreation, even mix? You hit kind of just conservation or just recreation, it's not going to necessarily limit our ability to fund you, but we really are looking for projects that are kind of somewhere in this sweet spot of the 3 in the middle. So think very deliberately about kind of how can you weave those two things together in your projects. What type of project are you doing? Monitoring, research, restoration, very simple. And this is where it kind of gets into some of these things from our expenditure framework. What program priorities are you addressing? Our expenditure framework that I showed from our website gets into a little bit more detail here. Once again, what type of animals are you working with? And then these are some more specific questions about conservation strategy areas, strategy species, and there are links to kind of help guide you through that. And once again, this button, does your project address any aspects of drought or wildfire? You are not graded for or against this. Be truthful to the best of your ability here. If you hit no, that does not limit your funding by any stretch. It just helps us guide where we would fund your project out of with the resources we have at hand. So budget. This is something I do want to kind of go through. Budget clarity and budget costs are very important for your grading. You are allowed to request up to $50,000. Your project being $5,000 or $50,000 does not limit or affect our interest or ability to fund you. We do not mind if you ask for the full amount. We just want to make sure that the project breakdown justifies that full amount. If you have a project that is easily done for $5,000, great, submit it. If you really need $50,000, then great, submit it. That does not impact how we look at your project and score it. What does impact it is how you justify the needs. So total project costs, this is your whole project. If you have one of those big projects that is like to beginning to end with all of your stages is 150,000, obviously we would only fund up to 50. We just want to know how much does it take to do all of what you need to do. Then here's the next one is the matching funds. You are not required to have matching funds. If your project beginning to end can be done under $50,000, great. We do not require matching funds. If your project is very, very large and it's like $150,000, obviously we're curious if you have that extra $100,000 in hand. Once again, it does not grade for or against you, but it helps us understand what stage of planning you're in if you don't have those other funds in hand already. Once again, this is kind of the buckets of work that we allow. So administrative and indirect costs. Really administrative and indirect costs for the scope of OCRF, you only are allowed to ask for 20% of the total project costs. So be very clear, this is new. regardless of if you have a federally negotiated rate, regardless of if you have a pre kind of determined rate with ODFW particularly, OCRF is now only allowing up to 20%. If you have lower, that's perfectly fine. If you don't want to include any indirect, that's perfectly fine. But indirect really is those costs that you can't necessarily directly tie back to the project, but without expending them, the project doesn't exist. So examples of that would be insurance costs. You can include, some people include that in their indirect costs. Other people, as you can see down here, include it in the other. That's perfectly fine how you want to do that. Also rent on office buildings, your budget analyst, your accountant, your payroll, fiscal assistant, those are all administrative costs. Personnel, we do pull out separate. Personnel would be, an example would be the person of doing the physical project. Sometimes personnel can also be your executive director. If your executive director is in the day-to-day or in the direct management of the project, you can list them as personnel. If your executive director is not directly tied to your project, but obviously they're integral to the project moving forward, that direct executive director cost would go into your indirect calculation. So we can always talk about that if there is any questions there. Otherwise, the rest of these should be pretty standard categories, and the other category is pretty fluid with how you want to use that. My recommendation is you click it as other, come and chat with me or send me an email and we can talk about that. Very, very few things are off the table for what OCRF is allowed to help fund, but we have definitely been brought some very curious questions recently. So if it doesn't easily fall into one of these different categories, let us know. One of those kind of others that came up recently is land acquisition. Traditionally, OCRF kind of doesn't necessarily do land acquisition, but we can and we have. So one thing just to consider is that we do not pay for interest on loans or anything like that, but we would pay a principal on a loan if it's brought forward in advance so that we can talk about that. Permits we have paid for, taxes on lands or taxes for things we have not paid for. So those are all different categories that could potentially go into your other. Once again, this is kind of just a breakdown. We really want you to be specific. So if you clicked, and I'm going to go up here, that you have contract services, equipment, and personnel, when you come down to the OCRF section, I want to know contract services, $10,000 for XYZ, personnel, $20,000 for 20 hours at this pay rate for this person. I don't need a name of the person, I need the position. So I do want you to be specific. The same is for your matching funds. We acknowledge that matching funds are funds you already have in hand. And this could be $100,000 for seed and sod for landscaping. So be as specific as you can here, but we do want to see what is being spent for OCRF and what is being spent for matching funds. Remember, if your project doesn't have matching funds or it's below the 50,000 limit, you don't need matching funds, so you can just put NA here. In in-kind support, this is sometimes a good spot for people to think about monetary value, non-monetary value per se of things. Sometimes youth groups just want to come and volunteer to help do your plantings. You can't really put a price tag on the cost of labor for a youth group to come and help. That's where you would put something like that. But if you have a contractor, hypothetically, doing half the construction as a matching fund for no cost, then you would put it in the matching funds because they could tell you what the value would have been. All right.
I have a question on eligible expenses. Do you, would OCRF pay for like surveys needed to make projects happen, like heritage surveys or NEPA analysis on federal lands?
That's an excellent question. So the physical survey, yes, we would totally pay for that. So if you need to hire a contractor or pay your own staff to do that, we would 100% pay for those. If from NEPA, I'm not completely familiar with that, but if there's permit costs associated with applying and or fees associated with that, we can talk offline for there. There's a little bit of kind of a gray area of what kind of permit fees we can and cannot pay for. And I would want to check with my contracts team on that. But the actual contract for the survey, we would 100% pay for.
Okay, thank you. I can follow up with an email to you with more specific details on that.
That'd be great. Thank you. So I'll pause here. Are there any other questions? And this is kind of going to be our last section to go through before I open it up and address the questions in the chat. All right. So this next section, I do just want to spend a couple minutes highlighting because there's been questions in the past, is applicant track record. Applicant track record is 3 points on the scoring rubric, but really what it is there for is for an example, I don't need to necessarily know what your organization is. You don't need to be in the newspaper. You don't need to be one of like the main organizations in the state, but we do want to know is, do you have the skills and the abilities to do this project? And how have you demonstrated that? So things like, have you applied to an OCRF grant in the past? We do not count that against you or for you. So if you've gotten a grant the last cycle, we don't care per se. That does not limit your ability to get the next grant. But what it does denote for us is, oh, we've seen your work before and you have had a successful grant, or it does remind me as the program coordinator to go back and say, make sure that, are you up to date on all your paperwork? Have you been responsive? Have you filled out everything? So here's just some additional things. Has the lead organization contacted an ODFW staff? Highly recommend, you don't have to contact ODFW particularly, but if there's other resource managers or educational groups or initiatives in your area, reach out to them and see, like, are they doing similar work? Is this going to help address a state need? There are multiple state and federal and local and tribal governments and organizations that you can reach out to and kind of help coordinate there. And if you have, just briefly provide their name and affiliation so that we can kind of help figure out who have you been coordinating with. Examples of past work, really, we want to make sure that this is applicable to what you're actually asking for. And also, if you don't have examples of past work, we do want to know skills needed to do the project. This is not a place for you to write your CV or your resume. So your curriculum vitae or your resume, we don't want that here. But if you are an expert in ArcGIS and that is a critical part of this project, you can say lead project organizer, ArcGIS expert. Like those are the types of things we would want here. And also, we do not accept any sort of additional emailed and or attached documentation to this application. So if you have anything that you want to show as past work or skills that help with this project or your group's website, please put them in this section with a web link, and we can pull them up from there. We are not accepting emailed anything at this point. And you also do not need letters of recommendation. That is not part of our application. That's really in lieu of those letters of recommendation. We just want to know who in the community you've been talking with to see if your project really is needed and how you can fit into other work. Last section, briefly, just for us to go through, is this is basically more going to be used if your project is awarded. Basically, we need to know, is your organization a public entity? We must have your federal tax ID number. This is what we use to double check that your organization's actually eligible for funding prior to us actually awarding the funds. And additionally, some of these questions of who owns the land, is it adjacent to publicly owned land? None of this is going to be counted against you in your scoring. This is just to help us kind of get some of that information if you're awarded to get your contract up and running. We also do clearly need to know Are there any permits that the project needs? Are they in place? That is important, and that this question is actually on the grading, that you are aware of what permits that you need. And the last thing I'm going to say on this page is basically just about insurance. The OCRF is now requiring that projects hold project insurance. And this project insurance is dependent upon what type of organization you have and what you're doing and what that risk is. We really want to make sure that insurance requirements are not a deterrence or hampering the ability of the applicant or the project to move forward. So there is a question in here basically saying, if you do not have basic insurance, budget that into your project. If your project is already maxed out on its budget and you still don't have that basic insurance, tell us through this application. There's a button further down that says, is it likely that you're going to need additional assistance monetarily to help cover insurance costs? This question will not impact how we score, but what it will do is it will give us the ability to know that you might need additional assistance, and we do have additional funds outside of the allotted for this grant cycle to help. So we highly recommend that you have insurance in place, that you try to budget it into your project, but if it becomes a situation that you can't, then talk with me prior to submitting your project, and we can kind of figure out the best path forward and make sure when you submit your project, you hit this yes button. Another thing that I do want to last thing before we move on is primary applicant prepayment. Traditionally, OCRF runs a reimbursement system, which means if you are awarded, your funds are reimbursed after you expend. So you have to pay for something, send me the receipt, and then I will pay for it. Send your check for you to pay it. If you need an upfront payment because your organization does not have funds in hand, then you need to make sure that you click that in this button here. This is not affecting anything other than just our ability to do contracts and understand the situation you're in. Also, conflict of interest. This is a new for this grant, but I do want to make sure everyone's aware. Please fill this out. If you have a question, let us know. Conflict of interest is defined on our state website, and I can also walk you through this question. So with that, I'm going to stop sharing. I will be reading questions from our chat first, and then I will open it back up for everyone. And dependent on timing, I am able to stay a little bit later if needed. All right, so I'm going to read these. All right, so Tim, I see a direct message to me. I am going to actually address yours later since you did not make your question public. I did not want to read it to everybody, but I will move on to Sam. So Sam's question is about how many applications do you receive each year round, and is there an average funding level? So great question. The OCRF offers roughly 2 different funding cycles each year. We have been receiving roughly 30 to 60 applications each time. We roughly fund about 20 each funding cycle. Average funding ask is about 40,000, but we will get everything from 5 to 50. And as I said, that does not make a difference for how we grade. All right, so another question is someone has a project that fits really well with the OCRF funding, but they won't have the final plans designed by the fall deadline. Will there be another funding round this biennium? Yes, there will be another funding round this biennium. And that will most likely open in January, February time. However, if the project that you are proposing, you have funds in hand to do your planning, the planning is ongoing and already initiated, you can apply for phase 2 of that project without phase 1 being fully completed. So if you have the money, the planning is in process, the planning is on schedule to be completed, you can actually apply for funding and ask for the funding to start, say, in 2024, the end of 2023. That is perfectly fine. We can always talk about that. But there will be another funding round in later on, so you can always talk about that. And for this January upcoming in 2023 funding round, those funds would need to be expended most likely the end of 2025, but that has not been officially set yet. Another question is, although match isn't required, does it help a project as a way of demonstrating buy-in? Yes, to an extent, but that's not your only way of showing buy-in. So match is great. It does show community interest, but there's many other ways to do community interest, such as in-kind contributions or really project participation, your project partners. So buy-in's critical, but match and fiscal backing is not your only way of getting that. All right, it says, can you provide some additional examples of projects the OCRF has funded in the past as a direction for OCRF might fund in the future? So that is a great question, and you can find on our website, you will actually see a list of past projects, and I can direct this individual to that if you aren't able to do that, find them. But we have really funded a wide range of things. We have funded youth summer camps where school children learn how to swim and learn about nature. We have funded building of gazebos. We have funded restoration of land. We have funded willow plantings. We have funded beaver surveys, a lot of large animal surveys such as wolverines and foxes. We have funded mussel surveys. We have funded learn to swim and kayak projects. We have funded basically alteration of hunting and fishing gear so that individuals with disabilities could hunt and fish and learn how to language translations. We've done a lot of funding. So really a very wide range, and you can find on our website a complete list. To date, the OCRF has funded since our existence 90 projects. Another question, two questions. Can ODFW itself apply for a grant? Yes, ODFW can apply for a grant, but, and this holds true for all individuals, we highly recommend it. A single organization is not the only applicant. You must really, really have project partners. So if ODFW wants to apply for a grant, it is graded and reviewed no differently than any of the other grants we have forward, and we still want you to have project partners. If the project is currently ongoing, but funding is needed from OCRF to complete it, is there any special way to indicate this on the timeline? Yes, on the timeline, if you have a project that is started, but for some reason funds are not sufficient to complete it, clearly denote that within your background and your need, as well as your project timeline section of the application is open text. But so what I mean by that, it's just a text block. So put a couple sentences explaining what's going on. Why do you need this for mid-project? And then bullet your timeline after that. I would say that a project needing additional funds to complete has been done, but be very mindful to explain why the project ran out of funding or the project was not completed with its existing funding. So just be very clear, like cost changed or timeline changed, or the project got more excitable and more people, or new change in what we wanted to do. Just try to provide that information. You have plenty of areas to do that. So another question is, if the project does not fall within a specific conservation area or benefit to Oregon ODFW wildlife priority strategy species, will that impact project score? We need projects to help enhance the conservation strategy as a whole. You do not need to specifically hit a conservation area and or a priority species, but you need to be very clear about what it is addressing within the conservation strategy. So you will see within the Oregon Conservation Strategy, there are additional sections that talk about drought, talks about climate, talks about invasive species, talks about disease, talks about basic whole ecosystem resiliency. So if you aren't very specific on, I have a priority species or I have a priority area, kind of lean on that section of the conservation strategy. Almost all projects that do have a conservation lens do address parts of that, and I can always be available to help. All right, I ran out of questions, so I will pause and ask if anyone has any other additional questions you'd like to verbally say, and this was recorded. I know I went pretty fast, if anyone has any other thoughts. All right, hearing none and seeing no additional chat messages, I would like to thank you for everybody's time. I am going to stay on to answer Tim's question, but I would like a verbal agreement from Tim that I can read it aloud. And also, I do want to make sure everyone knows this was recorded. This will be posted on our website. And I will be holding another informational session in about 2 weeks. It will have the exact same information as we had today. So it's not going to be any different, but you are welcome to hop on there if you have any other additional questions. And as always, thank you all for being here. And I would like to ask Tim, if you don't mind unmuting for a second, would you like me to read your question, or would you like
Yes,
to share
please.
it?
I'm sorry, I didn't realize I was just addressing it to you. Yes, that'd be fine.
Okay, perfect. Thanks.
Or I could restate it myself if you'd prefer.
Let's have you restate it because it is a long one. So
Yeah, and I could make it longer. So we've been engaged with U.S. Fish and Wildlife and the Friends of the Willamette Valley National Wildlife Refuge for several years, creating a nature center at Ankeny Hill National Wildlife Refuge. So we already have phase 1 of that completed, a two-room classroom, Gaylor Hall, that has been deployed and is in use now. We're hosting environmental education programs from throughout the community, including Straub Outdoor Learning, Turner Library, other organizations that have environmental education programs are free and invited to use the facility at no cost with our support. We need one additional classroom down on our original plans called for a phase 2, which would have an additional classroom down at Peregrine Marsh, where we could have a wetlands node and address related topics to a wetlands environment. We had funding for that, but that plan was a few years old, and now building costs have increased that. We've already talked to an architect and a builder so we can get some realistic ideas of what it's going to cost to build this additional classroom. And so we're in that process. We won't start construction until next late spring or fall after the rainy season. So we won't begin it then, but we have already started, this design process. And I just wondered how that would fit into your timeline, if that would be an appropriate project.
yeah, so that's an excellent question. It would definitely be kind of in our new area. So kind of the new range of what we have and haven't funded. So we have funded gazebos and kind of outdoor structures. Physical buildings we have not funded yet. So I would have to double check exactly how that would fit in, but I think it probably could. One thing we do want to be mindful of, and I obviously have your contact information so we can chat a little bit more offline, is that it's going to be important for us to kind of have OCRF pay for a specific component of it. Like if there's like outside landscaping or something that we kind of can wrap OCRF funds around. In addition, we would need to be very mindful that whatever OCRF paid for if it was awarded, specifically kind of fell within our timeline. We can't pay for anything that's already been done. So you would need to be very clear that with it, whatever contracts you have with your contractor, if OCRF funds are awarded, which I think we could have this project fall into that, but because it's a permanent structure versus some of these land structures, it might be a little bit different of a contract if awarded. You don't have that as part of another contract. You'd almost have to kind of pull it out. Does that make sense?
And I think we could probably do that.
Okay, perfect.
We could separate the design and construction portion of it. We might even be able to pull out specific construction elements like the electrical. We're looking at putting in a rainwater captioning system as part of it, which could be kind of pricey. We're also going to have solar panels down there. We could maybe even break it into pieces like that. We're also going to have a wetlands node, environmental education component built as part of that classroom, which is really kind of an outdoor classroom. So it will also serve as a as a wildlife viewing building, which will have walls that can be opened up, or peepholes that can be opened up for wildlife viewing of that wetlands. So it'll be multifunction, and I think we can pull pieces out to satisfy your funding needs.
Yeah, and I would highly recommend that. And as I said, we can chat a little bit more. Kind of the examples that you said about solar panels or rain catchment, very condensed beginning to end components. Those type of things would be much easier for us to work with. And those type of things most likely would not be considered permanent because of the lifespan of that compared to a building. So that would be another consideration just from a contracting standpoint. But I can, since you have my email, feel free to email me and then I can kind of get us in touch and make sure that whatever you would be proposing would be beginning to end appropriate so we don't have any issues later on.
Excellent.
Okay, excellent.
I will do.
And I just saw another hand up. Was there any other questions? I'm happy to stay on until everyone's questions are answered.
Charlotte, that was me, Michael Babbitt. I'm also with Salem Audubon, as is Tim Johnson. And actually, I was going to ask a question that you guys just now finished discussing. So I just sent you a message back. So thank you.
Okay, excellent.
Yeah.
Okay, so I have a couple more people still on. It looks like there is 4 of us in the room. Is there any other questions from anyone online?
Thank you, Charlotte.
All right, hearing none. Yeah, thank you guys so much for coming. And I'm going to end the meeting for everyone. So have a great day.
Thank you.